Henry Brown was born into a world of forced labor and constant uncertainty around the year 1815 on a sprawling tobacco farm in Louisa County, Virginia. His owner was John Barrett, a relatively substantial planter whose land stretched over the rolling hills of the central Virginian countryside. While Brown's early experiences were characterized by the essential contradiction of slavery, the constant presence of coercion, and the denial of basic human rights, he often reflected later that his childhood was shielded from the extremes of cruelty that defined other plantations. Barrett, a man who valued efficiency and profitability above sadism, was known to his slaves as a master who neither whipped nor caused to be whipped. This was not benevolence, it was calculated management. It meant that Brown and his fellow slaves lived under a fragile, unspoken contract. Work diligently, show obedience, and you would be spared the lash. Yet this fragile stability held a far greater invisible terror, the fear of separation. Brown was an observant and intelligent child. He quickly mastered the rhythms of plantation life, the planting and curing of tobacco, the endless chores. But even in this managed environment, the lessons of his bondage were clear. He was property. His existence was transactional. He understood early that his skills and labor were his only bargaining chips in the merciless economy of the antebellum South. When Henry was about 15, a major shift occurred that would define his future. John Barrett relocated Henry to the state capital, Richmond, Virginia, to work in his bustling tobacco manufacturing plant and dry goods store. Richmond in the 1830s was not just a political capital, it was the industrial and commercial heart of the Upper South, a city of chimneys, docks, and immense wealth built on enslaved labor. Henry was no longer a field hand, he was now an industrial slave. The factory environment was loud, dirty, and demanding, but it offered a new kind of exposure. He learned the complex processes of stripping, curing, and packaging tobacco. More importantly, he learned the mechanisms of commerce. Working in the dry goods store, he observed how money flowed, how goods were shipped, and how the white world conducted its business. He learned to read addresses, identify shipping labels, and understand the logistics that underpinned the entire Southern economy, knowledge that would prove fatal to the institution that held him. Richmond was a city of stark contrasts. Free black people walked the streets, holding precarious positions as skilled artisans and laborers, providing Henry a glimpse of what freedom looked like. Meanwhile, the city's notorious Shockoe Bottom district served as the epicenter of the domestic slave trade, where human beings were held in grim, windowless pens before being auctioned off to the Deep South. Henry passed these pens daily, the screams and cries a constant, visceral reminder that his fate was always precarious, regardless of his skill or the relatively mild nature of his immediate master. The invisible threat had a name: the auction block. Amid the cacophony and anxiety of Richmond, Henry found profound solace and purpose. He met Nancy, an enslaved woman of intelligence and quiet strength, owned by a neighbor named Mr. Smith. They courted under the strict, watchful eyes of their respective masters, and with permission were married, a union recognized by God and the community, but entirely contingent on the will of their owners. Together they built a family and an entire world inside the boundaries of their servitude. They had 3 children, a boy and 2 girls. For a decade, they navigated the constant, delicate dance required of enslaved families in the city. Henry worked tirelessly, using his superior wages earned in the factory to buy small comforts and necessities for his family, always dreaming of the ultimate purchase, their freedom. Henry made repeated appeals to Nancy's owner, Mr. Smith, offering every penny he could save. He was repeatedly met with refusal. Smith was polite but firm. Nancy and the children were valuable assets. The constant anxiety began to manifest physically in Henry. Every rumor of a debt, every passing conversation about a sale was like a physical blow. He understood the economics better than most. The value of his family grew every year. The disaster struck in the spring of 1848. Mr. Smith suddenly found himself in deep financial trouble. The family was instantly converted from people into collateral. Despite Henry's tearful and desperate pleas, despite offering Smith every last cent he had saved, the decision was final. Nancy and the 3 children were sold to a North Carolina planter. The separation was immediate and brutal. Henry was allowed a brief, final farewell, a moment so agonizing it would haunt his subsequent life. He watched his wife and children taken away, marching south with a coffle of other doomed souls, vanishing into the system that had promised them a family, only to cruelly snatch it away.
Realized that as long as he remained enslaved, his life was not his own, and any love he fostered was simply a temporary loan from a brutal system. His despair eventually curdled into a cold, hard resolve. His only path back to Nancy and his children was to achieve freedom and then buy them back, no matter the cost. But traditional escape was too slow, too dangerous, and the slave catchers were everywhere. Henry needed a miracle, a way to disappear from Richmond entirely, bypassing all the patrols, all the laws, and all the conventions of the South. He started looking at the tools of his trade, the crates, the manifests, the express labels, not as containers for tobacco, but as potential vehicles for liberation. Henry confided his desperate goal in 2 men he trusted implicitly. The first was Samuel A. Smith, a free black shoemaker in Richmond. Samuel was a resourceful and courageous man who understood the city's underbelly and the hidden pathways of resistance. He was skeptical, but listened patiently to Henry's increasingly daring ideas. The second was an unlikely ally, James C. A. Smith, no relation to Samuel, a white storekeeper who had dealings with Henry at the factory. James was secretly sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, a profoundly dangerous stance in Richmond. James had access to the tools, the contacts, and, critically, the Adams Express Company. Henry laid out his plan. He would ship himself north. James C. A. Smith was horrified. "Henry, it's madness. It's suicide. A man can't survive for a day in a shipping crate, much less the time it would take to reach Philadelphia." Henry, his eyes shining with a strange, feverish resolve, simply replied, "But I must, sir. I would rather die in that box than live another hour here as a slave." His devastating loss had provided him with a courage that transcended the fear of death. They began the meticulous, terrifying preparations. The dimensions of the vessel were crucial. It had to be small enough to be handled as freight, but large enough for Henry to survive. They settled on a pine box measuring 3 feet 1 inch long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet 6 inches deep, just enough room for Henry to fold himself into a fetal-like position. They lined the interior with coarse woolen cloth, hoping to provide minimal cushioning. A few tiny air holes were bored discreetly near the top, with a small tool called a gimlet, just enough to allow a trickle of air. The destination was set: Philadelphia, the heart of the abolitionist movement. The recipient had to be a known abolitionist, capable of handling such an extraordinary delivery. They secured the name of James Miller McKim, a prominent member of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society. The fictional consignee on the label would be William H. Johnson, a name the abolitionists had prearranged to recognize. The cost was staggering, $86, equivalent to thousands of dollars today, plus additional bribes and payments for supplies. Henry liquidated everything he owned. The final element of the plan was perhaps the most ingenious and terrifying. Henry needed a day off work to be packaged. To ensure his absence wasn't tracked, he intentionally burned his hand severely with sulfuric acid, oil of vitriol, causing a painful wound that guaranteed him a sick day. The agony was part of his down payment on freedom. The stage was set. In the early hours of March 29, 1949, Henry Brown, the industrial slave, met his two co-conspirators in a secluded Richmond warehouse. The crate lay ready, stenciled with the address and the fateful words, "This side up with care."